The NFL is home to some of the greatest quarterbacks in the world, so today I wanted to create a tier list for all the 2024 starting quarterbacks in the NFL. So as you guys can see, we have a tier list with 6 different tiers, starting off with the best. This is pretty self-explanatory. These are your Patrick Mahomes of the world. Then we have the very good category. These are quarterbacks who I think are good enough to win a championship, but just not quite yet on that the best category. Then you have good enough. These are guys who I think are good enough to get you into the playoffs, may make a deep run, and if you have the right team around them, they can maybe win a championship. Then you have mid. These are quarterbacks who, in my opinion, are just there for the ride. They're your typical average quarterback. They're not going to hurt you, but they're not necessarily going to win you many games. Then you have below average. These are quarterbacks who are not quite bad enough to where you want to instantly replace them, but they're also just not very good. Then you have the they suck category. Very self-explanatory. These are quarterbacks who are likely going to lose their job very soon. Now for this tier list, I'm going to be projecting every single quarterback on what I expect them to do next year. So if this is a little bit harsh for certain players, you guys will hopefully understand my perspective of building out this tier list for what I think the quarterbacks are going to be able to do next year. Let's go ahead and get started off with Aaron Rodgers. Now Aaron Rodgers is a really bizarre case because on one hand, I think he's going to have a very interesting and good year because of the team around him, but he is almost 40 years of age, and yes, he wants to win another MVP, and yes, he wants to be this greatest quarterback ever. I just don't know quite yet if I want to put him up here in the very good category. I do think Aaron Rodgers at this point in his career is due for kind of an interesting good year, but maybe not great year. I'll put him in the good enough category for now. I'll definitely eat crow if this Jets team does make a deep playoff run though. Next up we have Anthony Richardson. If you guys know me, I'm extremely high on Anthony Richardson. I think he's going to be a very good quarterback in the NFL, but putting him over a guy like Aaron Rodgers is going to be very tough for me, but in this situation, I'm willing to do it. I think him being in that Shane Steichen system another year, if he stays healthy and if his shoulder doesn't give him any issues, we're talking about a quarterback who, in my opinion, can easily be a top 10 quarterback, which to me, in order to be in the very good category, I have to consider you a candidate to be a top 10 quarterback. I do so with Anthony Richardson. Next up, we have Baker Mayfield. Now, last year, he was actually pretty good, but I give a lot of the credit to Dave Canales, who is now going to be joining Bryce Young with the Carolina Panthers. And with that being said, I don't really think he's going to be all that good next year. I don't want to necessarily say he's going to be a bad quarterback, but I think he's going to be slightly below average. And what I mean by that is, I don't really know if he's going to be able to take this decent Buccaneers team into a deep playoff run. I even have some question marks if he can make them be an average team in terms of the rest of the NFC. I don't think the Buccaneers will make the playoffs next year. Thus, I'm going to give Baker Mayfield below average. Next, we have Bo Nix. Now, I'm going to put him in the they suck category, but that's just simply because I don't think he's going to be a very good quarterback on what is a very bad team. Does that mean he's going to be a terrible quarterback for the rest of his career? Absolutely not. I think the future is bright for Bo Nix. I just think as of right now, with the situation around him and with what I think about Bo Nix right now, I don't think he's really worthy of being anywhere higher than the they suck category. Next up, we have Brock Purdy. Now, me personally, I'm not the highest on Brock Purdy as a quarterback by himself, but I do think that he is good enough with a fantastic roster around him to put him in that good enough category. I'm actually going to put him right behind Aaron Rodgers in terms of I would rather have Aaron Rodgers on my team, but I do think Brock Purdy is good enough to get this team, which is super loaded, into a deep playoff run. Next up, we have Bryce Young, and last year he would have been in the they suck category, but this year I actually think he's going to be pretty decent in terms of with his development and with his processes. The team around him is a lot better, some better running backs, some better weapons, a better offensive line, a better defense, better coaching staff. I think he's going to be in for a pretty solid year. I don't think he's going to be good enough to get that Panthers team anywhere close to the playoffs, but I do think they're going to be a very average to decent team next year in terms of what our expectations might be. Next up, we have Caleb Williams. Now, I do project that Caleb Williams is going to be a very good quarterback in this league. Will it be instantly though? It's really hard to tell. As of right now, I'm going to have to put him in this mid category, but that's just simply because I don't really know what he's going to be next year. I'm all projecting what I think they can be. I haven't seen that offense hit the field quite yet. I don't know what the offensive line and the run game and the receiving core is going to look like. So for now, I just kind of put him in that average quarterback conversation, which is totally fine for a rookie quarterback. Next up, we have CJ Stroud. I do project him to be very good next year. I'm not going to put him quite yet in the best category, but I am going to put him in the front of the line of the very good category. We're already talking about him as a rookie last year being a top 10 quarterback. I easily think he's going to be a top 10 quarterback this year. That Houston Texans team is loaded with talent. CJ Stroud should be one of the best quarterbacks, if not maybe the best quarterback in the NFL. Next up, Dak Prescott. Now, Dak Prescott last year would have been in the conversation for being one of the best quarterbacks based off what he did last year. I don't think he's going to be as good as he was last year, but I will put him in a good enough category. I'm going to put him him right in front of Aaron Rodgers, just because I do think he's going to get that team to the playoffs, and I would not be surprised if Dallas were to win a playoff game or two. I just don't know if quite yet if I'm ready to commit to saying that Dak Prescott will be a top 10 quarterback in 2024. We'll just kind of have to wait and see, but I wouldn't be shocked if he's in the very good category by the end of next year. Next up, we have Daniel Jones. Now, this one's also interesting because just 2 years ago, he was a pretty solid quarterback. He probably would have been in that mid conversation, but given the fact that I'm just not that big of a believer in Daniel Jones, I'm going to put him in the they suck category. I'm actually going to put him in front of Bo Nix, but that's just simply because the Giants have a somewhat better roster around Daniel Jones, but it's still not a very good team. They took a lot of steps back this offseason, but they also took some steps forward in some positions. But I do believe that their head coach is going to be good enough to get Daniel Jones to just be okay next year. So we're going to put him in the they suck category, but I don't think he's going to be the long-term quarterback for the Giants moving forward. Next up, we have Derek Carr. Now, I actually think that Derek Carr is going to be somewhat okay next year. If you actually look at his stats and look at some of his performances last year, he was actually a decent quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. Unfortunately, when I say he's just good enough, that's kind of all I think he will be. I think he'll be just good enough to get this team to around 7 to 9 wins next year, but I wouldn't be very shocked if they made the playoffs, but they won't be winning any playoff games next year. He's not top 15, he's not top 10, he's just mid. Next up, we have Deshaun Watson. Now, 2019, we would be talking about being one of the best quarterbacks, but ever since he's joined the Browns, he's been a very meh quarterback to below average. I do think this Browns team is overall pretty solid altogether, but I'm leaning towards the mid and below average category. I just don't know quite yet where I want to put him. I'll put him right next to Derek Carr in the mid category. I think Caleb will be better than him, but I wouldn't be shocked if Deshaun is pretty decent next year. I don't think he's top 10. I don't think he's top 15. I think he's somewhere between maybe 15 to 22, somewhere in that range, which in my opinion doesn't really suit that well for a guy like Deshaun Watson. Next up, we have Drake May. Now, I don't actually think he's going to be starting next year, so I'm going to put him at the very back of the line. I do have a feeling that either Bailey Zappi or Jacoby Brissett will start the majority of the season, which is the right thing to do for Drake May and his development. I'm a big fan of Drake May. I think he's the second best quarterback in this year's draft. That being said, I'm going to put him in the very last in the they suck category at the very back because I don't think he's going to get a whole lot of playing time this year. Next up, we have Gardner Minshew, the Las Vegas Raiders quarterback. Now, will he start over Aiden O'Connell is still to be determined. I kind of think he will start over Aiden O'Connell, especially if things pan out the way that I think they will. I don't think Gardner Minshew is a bad quarterback, but I will put him in the below average category right behind Baker Mayfield. I do think Baker's going to be a better quarterback than Gardner Minshew, but I do think Gardner Minshew has a pretty decent roster around him. Solid offensive line, some good weapons, a decent running back, pretty solid defense all around, and a head coach who I think can get the job done. I just don't think he's a top 15 or top 20 quarterback, so I'll put him behind Baker Mayfield. Next up, we have Geno Smith, the Seattle Seahawks quarterback. Now, will Sam Howell take over that starting spot at some point this year? That's always a possibility. I don't think it will happen. I'm a big fan of Geno Smith. I think he's good enough to be the starting caliber quarterback on a decent playoff team. Will they make a deep playoff run? Probably not, but in my opinion, all of these guys are quarterbacks who are in the conversation for the top 10. I just don't think that Geno Smith is quite a top 10 quarterback right now. Then you have Jalen Hurts. I do project that Jalen Hurts is going to have a big bounce back year based off of what I saw last year. Last year, the offensive coordinator play was just horrific. The team around him kind of took a big step back, but I think the team as a whole got better in the offseason. The defense is a lot better. Hopefully, the coordinator situation isn't worse than it was last year, and I do think Jalen Hurts will take some steps forward next year. I think he'll be a top 10 quarterback for sure next year. Next up, Jared Goff. I'll also put him in the very good category. I'm going to put him in between CJ and Anthony Richardson. I think he's going to be a top 10 quarterback pretty easily next year. That Lions team is loaded with talent. I would not be shocked if Goff is in MVP conversations throughout the season. Will he win it? Probably not, but if he's in that conversation, he's arguably the best quarterback in the league, so he'll be a top 10 quarterback. I feel pretty strongly about that. Next up, Jaden Daniels. I'm going to put Jaden Daniels in the mid category, but I'll put him at the very back end of it. That Washington Commanders team in total is actually pretty well put together in terms of what they did this offseason. You got a lot of really good receiving weapons. Offensive line still sucks, and the running game is still a little bit questionable, but I do believe in Jaden Daniels to be explosive enough to make enough big plays to make him a pretty solid quarterback all around. Will Washington make the playoffs? Probably not, but I don't think it's going to be because of Jaden Daniels per se. I think he'll be decent, but I don't think he'll be better than any of the quarterbacks in front of him. Next up, we have JJ McCarthy. Now, will he start over Sam Darnold? I don't think so, but I do think potentially by the end of the year, he could potentially be the starting quarterback, similar to Drake May. With that being said, because I don't know if he's going to start, I'm going to put him in between Bo Nix and Drake May, just because I don't think he's going to start early on, but I would find it more likely that he's going to start over a guy like Drake May, just just because of who the starting quarterbacks are over them. I trust Jacoby Brissett and Bailey Zappi more than I do with a guy like Sam Darnold. Next up, we have Joe Burrow, and I'm going to put him in the front of the line of the very good. If he's healthy, he has the team around him to make a deep playoff run. He's proven to be an MVP level quarterback. I do think he's going to be in that MVP conversations. Just stay healthy and keep playing good football. Joe Burrow is a very good quarterback. I have no questions that he's going to be in that conversation with the Strouds, the Anthonys, and the Jalen Hurts. Jordan Love is next, and I'm in that similar conversation with guys like Anthony Richardson and Jalen Hurts. I'll put him in front of both those guys. If he can repeat the success he had in the back end of last year, we're talking about a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. Now, is he going to be able to repeat all that success? I don't know quite yet, but I do have some faith in him. I think he's a fantastic quarterback, one of the best young and up-and-coming quarterbacks in the league. That Packers team is sneaky good. I don't really know if I should say sneaky, but they're a very good team. They're going to be in playoff contention, Super Bowl contention, and I think a big part of that is because of Jordan Love. Josh Allen, I think this one's pretty easy to say. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. To me, in order to make the best category, you have to be a consensus top 5 guy, and I do think that Josh Allen is very much a consensus top 5 guy. He may not be the best, but he's probably the second or third best in the NFL. Turnovers are really the only question mark I have with Josh Allen, but to me, I think his value is so much more than that. He's a dynamic passer. He's good in the pocket. He creates so many plays, and he's just one of the best quarterbacks. There's just not a whole lot to it. He's in the best category. I don't think I have to explain too much. Next up, we have Justin Herbert. Now, I would love to put him in the best category, but quite frankly, I don't think the situation around him is necessarily built for him to be a top 5 quarterback in the league. I do think as a talent, though, he's easily up there. So I'm going to put him right behind Jared Goff. And the reason why I'm doing that is because Goff has so many weapons offensively to go to, whereas Herbert doesn't quite have that proven guy quite yet. Like, I do believe in Quentin Johnston and Ladd McConkey and some of those pieces, but as of right now, we don't have any game time film on those guys being decent players in the NFL. So I just trust guys like Laporta and Amon-Ra St. Brown more so than I do with guys like McConkey and Quentin Johnston. I do think Justin Herbert, as a pure talent, though, is easily a top 10 consensus guy. I'm just not yet quite sold on the fact that I think he's going to be fantastic next year with all the pieces that are moving around and some question marks with the offensive personnel. Next, we have Kirk Cousins of the Atlanta Falcons. I'm going to put him right behind Aaron Rodgers and Dak Prescott. I do think Kirk Cousins is actually, I'm moving behind Brock Purdy as well. I do think Kirk Cousins is good enough to get the job done with this loaded Falcons offense. They got a good O-line, some good receivers, a good running back, pretty decent defense, and a defensive-minded head coach with a really good offensive coordinator. I'm a big believer in that Falcons team, and I do think Kirk Cousins will benefit from all those guys around him. Now, is he going to be a top 10 quarterback next year? I can't quite say that I'm a consensus top 10 believer in Kirk Cousins, but I do think he'll be in that conversation, which to me puts him in that conversation with guys like Dak, A-Rod, and Brock Purdy, but I think he's in the back of those guys. On those same lines, I'm going to put Kyler Murray in that conversation too. I think we oftentimes disrespect Kyler Murray when talking about top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL, but honestly, I don't really blame you guys for not putting him in the conversations more often. Injuries and just some inconsistent play here and there has pushed him off of those top 10 conversations. We haven't really seen Kyler Murray with a good team in quite some time, and next year the team got better, but I just don't know quite yet if it's going to be good enough to propel him into being a top 10 quarterback. With that being said, I will put him in the back end of the good enough category because I do think him as a player is good enough to take an average roster to a playoff spot. I just don't think that Cardinals team is quite yet average enough to make the NFC playoffs. Next up, we have Lamar Jackson, and to me, if you don't have him as a consensus top 5 guy, I think your list is a little bit off. In my opinion, Lamar Jackson is one of the best quarterbacks we've seen in this generation, especially when we talk about the athletic ability, the throws down the field, his accuracy, his just intelligence with the football. He's an incredible player, very good with the football, and that Ravens team is loaded next year, so they should be one of the top teams in the NFL, and if not, I think it's probably going to be on Lamar Jackson. He won the MVP last year. I would not be shocked if he won another one throughout his career. He's a fantastic quarterback, a top 5 consensus guy. In my opinion, he's going to be in the best category. Next up, we have Matthew Stafford of the LA Rams, probably my favorite quarterback in the entire NFL in all different categories. I just think that he, as a football player, is one of the more underrated quarterbacks in the league. In my opinion, he's a top 5 quarterback, or at least on that level. I don't think he's quite yet consensus top 5 though, but I will put him right behind Stroud. I think that Rams team in general is one of the more well-constructed rosters. They got so many offensive weapons, whether it's Puka, Cooper, Kyron Williams, Blake Corum, really stout offensive line, a solid defense. I'm a pretty big believer in this Rams team. I do think they'll be pretty solid, so I'm going to put Matthew Stafford in that top 10 conversation. I do think he's firmly in the mix there, and I think if you don't have him in your top 10, your list might be a little bit off because because I do think Stafford is a top 10 worthy guy, and I think next year he's going to be freaking awesome. Patrick Mahomes, he's going to be on the very top of this list. I don't think I have to make any sort of poems or sayings about why Mahomes is great. He's Patrick Mahomes. He's a 2-time back-to-back champion, probably going to be a 3-time next year. He's won one in the past, so we're talking about multiple championships already in his young career. He's the best quarterback in the NFL and probably will be for quite some time. Next up, we have Russell Wilson. I don't think he's going to be bad next year, but I don't want to necessarily say he's going to be great. I'm going to put him right in front of Derek Carr because that Steelers offense in general has a lot of really good pieces, so I do believe in a guy like Russell Wilson to be good enough to get at least this team to a playoff spot, but will they make a deep playoff run? I don't quite yet know. My favorite thing about this Steelers team is that overall, as a roster, it's actually a well put together team. It's just right now, I don't really quite know what I'm getting from Russell Wilson or Justin Fields. We'll have to wait and see, but I'm a big fan of the Steelers team. I just don't know if they're going to be able to seriously compete in a very tough AFC North. We'll see if Russell Wilson is good enough though, but I do think he'll be in that conversation with the Derek Carrs and Deshaun Watson of the world. Next up, we have arguably maybe the biggest wild card in this whole conversation is Trevor Lawrence, because I can see a world where he's in the conversations as the very good, but I can also see a world where he is below average next year. In my opinion, I think it's more than likely that he's going to be a very good enough quarterback to get the job done. I'll put him in the back with guys like Geno and Kirk Cousins. I'll put him there for now. I think Trevor Lawrence as a player has a lot of potential to be very good next year. He's got a pretty decent team around him. I wouldn't say it's particularly great, but I think the supporting cast is good enough for that team to make a playoff spot. That being said, their schedule is pretty tough, and I just don't know quite yet if Trevor Lawrence has quite reached that peak that we want him to hit. But if he can, we're talking about one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL as a pure talent. Now, we haven't seen it on the field yet, but I do think next year should be a kind of a breakout year for him, and I think if that's the case, we're going to be talking about him being a potential top 10 quarterback next year, so I'll have him in that conversation. Next up is Tua Tagovailoa. I will put him also in that same general spot with Trevor Lawrence, which is going to be in this good enough category. I do think Tua is an interesting case when it comes to being a player because we've seen the highs, but we've also seen the lows of Tua. We've seen him be, at certain points, one of the best quarterbacks in the world, like he was against the Denver Broncos, but then we also see him in the playoffs consistently get outplayed. Well, I guess last year was his only real chance, but he got outplayed pretty bad last year. And I just don't know quite yet if I would commit a ton of money to Tua Tagovailoa. I do think he's good enough to be considered a top 10 quarterback or around that area. I just don't know if he's good enough to get that team to a championship. It's one of the weirder things because he's a good quarterback, but is he a great quarterback? I don't really know. And last up, we have Will Levis of the Tennessee Titans. I'm going to actually put him a little bit higher than a lot of other people. I thought that he had a very good offseason in terms of all the pieces that were added around him. Alvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins, maybe Traylon Burks gets in the mix, Tyler Boyd, Tony Pollard behind him, Tyjae Spears, improved offensive line with J.C. Latham, and a pretty decent defense all around. In my opinion, this is kind of a make or break year for Will Levis, and I do think that he should be able to take full advantage of it. Being the starting quarterback for the Tennessee Titans comes with a lot of expectations, and I do generally believe in Will Levis. Obviously, time will tell, but I do think he's worthy of being in this mid conversation, but I really hope that I'm able to put him into that good enough to very good category pretty soon. So looking at my list, I think this is a pretty solid list. If you guys do disagree with any of the picks I have here, let me know. I think this is a general pretty good list. But if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and if you guys want to see more, again, make sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications, and I love you guys. Peace.